Hey, everybody. Thanks for closing out the week with us as we continue through the Gospel of Luke. Today we're in the 13th verse of chapter 23. This is Luke's final snapshot of the sentencing of Jesus. Just a quick review since we weren't together yesterday. Jesus has been before the council. He's been before Pilate. He's been before Herod. Herod has sent him back to Pilate, and this is the culmination of that narrative. So let me read it for you. It's a little bit longer, but I think it makes sense to deal with it all at once, and then we'll come back and talk our way through it. Pilate then called together the chief priests, the leaders, and the people, and said to them, "You brought me this man as one who was perverting the people. And here I have examined him in your presence, and I have not found this man guilty of any of your charges against him. Neither has Herod. He sent him back to us. Indeed, he's done nothing to deserve death. I will therefore have him flogged and release him." They all shouted out together then, "Away with this fellow. Release Barabbas for us." This was a man who had been put in prison for an insurrection that had taken place in the city and for murder. Pilate, wanting to release Jesus, addressed them again, but they kept shouting, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" A third time he said to them, "Why? What evil has he done? I found in him no ground for the sentence of death. I will therefore have him flogged and release him." But they kept urgently demanding with loud shouts that he should be crucified, and their voices prevailed. So Pilate gave his verdict, and that their demands should be met. He released the man they asked for, the one who had been put in prison for insurrection and murder, and he handed Jesus over as they wished. There is a lot happening in this passage. Let's start with the crowd. Perhaps that's in some ways the cleanest character in the story. The priests, the chief priests, they interact with Pilate in such a way that they make it clear that there's no other acceptable end to this for them except the crucifixion of Jesus. When Pilate says, "I'll release him," interesting in other tellings of this, Pilate refers to an old custom. Here Luke doesn't. He gives us the shorthand version of that. And the people, again, though, as they do in the other story, choose Barabbas. And as Pilate tries to get Jesus released, they increasingly refuse more and more aggressively, more and more passionately, until Pilate finally relents. And so this is Luke's way, I think, of making it clear. We alluded to this earlier in the week, that it is these chief priests, it is the crowd here, it is this group of men who have engineered this that are making sure it goes this way. In this telling, the blame for this really lands squarely on those religious leaders. They are the engineers of it, and they're bringing it to pass.
So there's so many layers to a story like this, Clint, and I think we have to kind of go layer by layer. I think the first layer is the thing that we're introduced to immediately off of the start. And so maybe it's worth taking a look at that. Right here in the first verse, the address of the text, we have verse 13. The Pilate's calling together the chief priests, the leaders, and then we have the people. And we might not have this in our translation, but one of the commentators on this passage makes the note that the word that we have translated here, people, is only used throughout the gospel to reference those people who are in opposition to Jesus, the religious leaders, the crowd who's angry at him. So here, Luke then, in writing, is able to distinguish between the crowd that gathers who are for Jesus, the people who welcomed him into the city, even the people who, on some level, have been following him and learning, and then the people who are resolutely set against him. And so this idea that the people set against Jesus are the same cast of characters who have been there all along. These are the people whose power are threatened. These are the people who have been offended by Jesus' teaching. And and this idea that it's the chief priests, the leaders, and then those people who are in opposition to Jesus, who are now the ones who are stepping up to see the action done. And that, we said this already in the previous study, but as we continue on in this study throughout Luke together, let's remember that ultimately it's the Gentile or the non-religious leaders who are the most receptive to Jesus. Herod doesn't bring a particular charge against Jesus. In fact, Jesus doesn't say anything to Herod. And then here, when Jesus is brought back to Pilate, we're told almost immediately in verse 15 here that Herod didn't make any charges, and he sent him back to Pilate. And then in these very clear words, Jesus has not done nothing to deserve death. We see an amazing kind of distinction happening here. The distinction between those who for religious reasons are upset with Jesus or for power reasons, and then the worldly leaders who do not experience the same threat. So there's this kind of inverted thing happening in the story where the person who you think would be upset would be the one who in this case is not. And the people who are generally the ones advocating for peace or for resolution, these are the ones calling for Jesus to be killed. And there's more layers deeper than that. But I just think it's worth noting that Luke wants us to be abundantly clear upon who the active characters in the story are. And that's not a surprise if you've been with us with the whole study. This cast of characters gone along the whole way, but they remain called out and explicit in this text.
Yeah, Luke goes so far there in verse 20 to say that Pilate wants to release Jesus. And the next layer of that story, I do think, involves Pilate. And here's a man who's in authority and yet is ultimately persuaded by keeping the peace, or at least keeping those who are loud and aggressive happy. Now, he does live under the danger, I suppose, of a revolt in a time like Passover. Jerusalem is full of Jewish people, and many of them have strong anti-Roman sentiments, and maybe this is some sense of just keeping the peace for Pilate. But though he clearly sees no reason to have Jesus executed, and in fact, actively tries to avoid that, ultimately gives in because of their urgent demanding with loud shouts, and their voices prevailed. And again, is that a sign of Pilate's weakness? Maybe. It certainly could be. I think the scripture is not going to let Pilate off the hook ultimately for his part in this drama. But in Luke particularly, I think, as you've said, Michael, the blame lands squarely in one place, and that's on the Jewish leaders. That's not a judgment against all Jewish people. It's not a judgment against all Jewish leaders. It is to say that Jesus as a Jew, as the Jewish Messiah, as the one who is coming for God's people, is rejected and is ultimately led to his death by the active work of those very same people. And what the Romans have to do with it is not of particular importance in the gospel story. And so Luke doesn't spend much time there, nor really do the other gospels. There's some interesting exchanges between Jesus and Pilate in the other gospels, but for Luke, that just distracts from the point that it is Jesus' own who are turning against him. And yes, they're using Pilate to do it, and maybe Pilate gives in when he didn't need to, and maybe Pilate's weak, and you could criticize him for that. But I don't think those are the questions Luke is asking, nor do I think those are the questions that Luke is putting before his readers. This is about Jesus and the rejection of Jesus by the very people who should know better and should know who he is.
There's also larger textual reasons, I think, for us to see that there are differences. Like, remember that this is part one. Part two is going to talk about, in the book of Acts, it's going to talk about how the church grows. And the church grows within a Roman context, Clint. It grows. In fact, Paul's story actually literally coincides with, at one point, protection by the Roman military from those who are out to kill him. And so the stories intimately woven, not just Jesus' story in this moment before Pilate, who represents Rome, but the church and the early church will live out its life on the platform of Rome's empire. And I think the fact that in the book of Luke, what we have here, this language, I want to pull this up for you, this language here that we have translated flogged, this is the only gospel translation that uses this word as opposed to the more brutal word of Jesus actually being, what is that? Not beaten. The more technical word for that, scourging. And so I think like that matters, and I think we should be aware of it, that at the end of the day, Jesus is here treated fairly, or as fairly as Pilate could from the start, and then he's moved by the crowd. And I think that kind of larger textual context matters, because what it reminds us is that the earliest church wasn't out to make enemies of the places where they were. They weren't out to cast people in a harsh light. But Luke here is trying to tell the story of how Jesus, the Son of God, ends up killed by crucifixion. And as we make our way forward into the story, I think I just want to point out for us that the call to crucifixion is a form of death penalty which is reserved for slaves, and it's reserved for the most despised enemies of Rome. It's not a common occurrence to be leveled against just a person who's been called up by religious leaders and made some people angry. In fact, the word that we have listed here in verse 19, insurrection, that's the kind of word that generally proceeded down the road really quickly. I mean, once that got rolling, Rome would be pretty upset, because insurrection stands against the political military power of Rome. And so there's just an interesting twist in this story, that on one hand, the crowd wants to up the punishment ante as high as it can go, while simultaneously Luke is letting us know, and the person that they're calling to be released is the kind of person who would even be considered for that punishment in the first place. And that irony is intentional. It's really, I think, showing us how difficult of a spot that the Pilate's being put into by the crowd that's gathered this day. So
we can then look at that layer, this character Barabbas that we don't know a great deal about, except in the few details we're told in the narratives, is that he is guilty of murder or charged of murder, and was put in prison for being an insurrectionist, which, interestingly enough, there were many ways to be put to death in Rome, and to get yourself on a cross was generally because you had been charged with sedition, revolt, or insurrection. You had, in other words, acted against the government. You had acted against Rome. If you had just done some other things, you might be taken to the Colosseum, you might be sold into slavery, you might have some other death penalty. But the cross, and specifically the publicness of the cross, they were on display as a way of saying, this is what happens when you go against Rome. And so what does that mean here in the context of the story? It means that this man, Barabbas, really is an enemy of Rome and has really done murder, which both Pilate and the Jewish religious people should care about, because he's far more dangerous in regards to the kind of trouble that he could make than Jesus is. Jesus, who has done neither of those things, is replaced, takes his place, and is then destined for the cross, the punishment for being one who creates or participates in an insurrection. The Roman government doesn't have a great concern over Jewish religious squabbles. As long as they don't spill into the public peace, as long as they don't create harm, as long as they don't foster anti-Roman sentiment or action, they really could care less that they don't like Jesus or Jesus doesn't like it. They're just not worried about that. But in this move, we see Jesus moving to a place, taking a role in which he is now judged by both the empire and the religion as guilty. And Pilate backs into that, maybe, so to speak, but that's still where we end up. So Barabbas goes free, and Jesus is sentenced. And, the innocent is found guilty, the guilty is released, and that is Luke's way of saying everything about this story is essentially upside down.
The wording here is particularly stark, maybe even foreboding. Verse 23, they kept urgently demanding with loud shouts that Jesus be crucified, and their voices prevailed. At the end of the day, Pilate had to make a calculus, and I think maybe Luke helps us see that in a way, particularly with him kicking Jesus over to Herod. You can see that as an effort to try to let the problem handle itself. When Jesus comes back, Pilate takes that sort of next step of attempting to say, hey, we're going to rough Jesus up. We're going to hurt him. We're going to make him miserable. And then we're going to send him on his way. A way of saying we're going to do something and then hoping that just blows over. And at the point at which we have, once again, these loud shouts, these urgent demands, it's at that moment where Pilate has to make a decision. Is he going to make these religious leaders angry? Is he going to call in the problems that are going to follow that kind of choice? Or is he just going to give in and allow it to happen? And of course, we see that listed explicitly, verse 24. He gives the verdict, their demand should be granted. And like you said, Clint, they let go the insurrectionist, and then they turn Jesus over to his execution, to the demands of those very loud being met. And ultimately then, the people who have been pursuing Jesus his entire career now can see those ends fulfilled. And I think it's something striking. There's almost a paired moment here, as in the beginning of this gospel, when Jesus goes to his home sanctuary, to his home community, he preaches the word there, he angers the crowd, and they carry him out to a hill to get rid of him on the charge of heresy. Here now, it is not the people who have the power to kill Jesus, but Pilate. And it is the people's urgent demands and their pleading and their crying and their political pushing. They have now convinced the Roman ruler that this is the path to take. And ultimately then they're going to this time succeed. And I think that Luke has told the story in such a way that we can see the bookends of that. We can see how the power has shifted from that first day until the last day. And we can kind of understand that though Jesus is equally in charge in both of those bookends, in this case, ultimately he's going to submit to the decision of Pilate, which we should read ironically in the text, the idea that Pilate is giving his quote-unquote verdict. The idea that the Son of God in front of him is allowing him to make that verdict shouldn't be lost on us. And then ultimately, God's plan will proceed from there.
Yeah, and remember, it wasn't that long ago that we saw that these religious leaders wanted to harm Jesus, but they were afraid of the crowds. And now by enlisting Pilate, by getting Pilate involved in this scheme, they've essentially protected themselves. They're demanding that Pilate do something, and Pilate has no fear of the crowds. Pilate isn't worried, and they get to do this from Pilate's in the driver's seat, but they're kind of steering the car. They're engineering this, making it happen, and yet now they're not taking the risk of whatever that might have been that we saw, even just a chapter or so ago, that they were afraid of the people. They have maneuvered, and they believe they've outmaneuvered Jesus. I don't think that's a fair way to say it from our perspective, because Jesus knew it was heading this way. But that's what they believe has happened.
Yeah, and I only want to point out that notice that Jesus has won every time that it fell to the rhetoric or to the argument. Every time Jesus, when brought questions or traps, he's responded, in a way that disarmed his opponents. Notice that the one place that his opponents have success, this shouldn't be lost on us, is in their pursuit of the power of the world. When they circle around Jesus, and they circle around the faith, and they circle around the law, and the conversation changes from what is right in God's eyes to instead, how can we leverage Rome's fears or Pilate's convenience? It's when they get to that level that they find success. And I don't think that's on accident that's pointed out, that ultimately they're only able to succeed when they turn to the self-centeredness or the shallowness of the world. They can't beat Jesus at the merit of the law or the faith or the tradition, so they have to find external means.
We will have some other opportunities, I think, early next week to have this conversation. But though Jesus is not perhaps where he wants to be in this moment, he is where he believes that he is supposed to be, needs to be, that this is Jesus' will. And I think maybe other gospels are slightly more explicit about that, but it's clear throughout all of the gospel stories. Jesus has not been the victim here. There is violence against him. There is dishonesty, scheming. There is political maneuvering. He does stand as the recipient of all of those negative and even sinful acts, but he is not where he is by accident, nor by being outmaneuvered or out-schemed or bad luck or anything else. Jesus is where he needs to be and where he wants to be in the sense of following God's will. You know, we saw in the garden, he would have liked to had another path, but he said, you know, your will, not my will, be done. And so Jesus is where he intends himself to be in this moment. And I think that's an important reminder. Jesus is if we can call Jesus a victim, he is a willing victim from that perspective.
I realize that we're going long here, so I'll be very brief, but I just think one other thing to note as we'll transition next week to the crucifixion story. Just Clint, up to this point, Luke has been very, very muted in conversations about physical violence to Jesus. It's been in there. There's been mocking. But the other gospel writers, I think, emphasize that aspect of this process to a higher degree. And in doing so, I think Luke is able to keep the focus of this story on that point, on what Jesus is allowing, and also the fact that Jesus is about his mission. This isn't about what other people are doing to him. This is about what Jesus has set his face to do. Now, that's to say that the other gospel writers help us see a fuller picture of this event. But I just think it's worth noting that different gospels emphasize different things. And this particular gospel doesn't spend a substantial amount of time talking about some of those aspects of the process.
Yeah, and in some ways, I think Luke sticks clearer, closer to the bare bones of the story. There's an interesting exception to that we'll run into right away next week, where Luke gives us a detail that nobody else seems to. Mm-hmm. But for the most part, I think you're right, Michael. I think that Luke doesn't get far from the main thrust of the story. So we don't have long conversations between Jesus and Pilate. We don't have Pilate's wife having a dream. We don't have all the maneuvering of the chief priests. Luke doesn't get distracted by those and just focuses kind of on the main thrust of the story. I think that's fair. I think that's well said.
We're going to continue on with this story. Hope that you will join us. Give this video a like if there's been something of interest or if you learned something from it. And also subscribe to this channel here on YouTube if that's where you're with us. Or, of course, you can find the audio podcast link in the description. Friends, we hope that you'll stick with us as we go through this story because Luke will lead us along this journey in a way that's powerful. And we look forward to seeing you next week.
Thanks, everybody.